Some wounds never heal, you know? They just burrow down, hiding out till the world digs them up again. And that's how it was for me. Marcus Holloway, standing on that wind-scoured ridge above Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, with nothing but the guilt of 15 lost years to keep me warm. Yeah, I'd built an empire, 200 men on my payroll, enough land to make a banker's eyes glaze, and a reputation that carried weight from Denver clear to Cheyenne. But none of that could fill the hollow place where family's supposed to be, not when the past kept finding ways to bleed into the present. Let me back up a sec. My brother Henry, the good one, the one who stayed while I ran, he'd passed, left behind a cabin, 40 rough acres, and a tangle of debts barely worth the paper they were written on. I'd come to settle affairs, nothing more. But when I got there, when I finally saw the state of things, it wasn't the rundown cabin or the bills that stopped me. It was two kids, Daniel and Rebecca Cartwright, orphaned twice over and hanging on to each other with a fierceness that said more than any plea for help ever could. Daniel, 10 years old, but looking at me like he'd already seen the world's worst and decided he'd stand anyway, just said, "I'll cut wood and my sister will cook." 8 words, no begging, no asking for pity, just a deal offered straight up. You ever meet a kid like that? You know what I mean. It shakes something loose in you. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town winter tried to kill every year. The wind cut sharp enough to slice hope to ribbons, and folks kept to themselves, fighting for survival. But Henry, he'd taken those kids in when nobody else would, and now that he was gone, there wasn't anyone lining up to take his place. Martha Sullivan, who ran the general store with the kind of backbone only hardship breeds, looked me up and down and said, "Henry always said you were a runner, Marcus. Maybe it's time you stopped." Man, I hated how she could see through me. I'd run from my own wife and boy years ago, thinking I was doing them a favor, leaving so they wouldn't have to watch me drown in the bottle and the nightmares from the war. Emma died a few years later, consumption they called it, and my son James got shipped off to Boston. 15 years, and the only thing I'd built was distance. But those kids, Daniel and Rebecca, they didn't let me wallow. Daniel worked like a grown man, splitting wood, mending fences, tending chickens, and Rebecca kept the place spotless, cooked meals out of practically nothing, her hands moving with the quiet surety of someone who knows home can disappear any minute. They'd lost everything, yet they still made room for a stranger at their table, still believed in the simple decency of sharing what little they had. You could see the past worn into the cabin's floorboards and the careful way Daniel watched the horizon, like he was waiting for another shoe to drop. That night, sitting by the fire, eating Rebecca's cornbread and beans, I realized these kids weren't asking for a savior. They just wanted a chance. Daniel said it again. "I'll cut wood, and my sister will cook." That's what he was offering: work, belonging, a place at the table if I was willing to earn it. Next morning, trouble rolled in with the sun. Territorial agent showed up, Winters, thin as a fence rail and twice as sharp, waving papers and talking about orphan asylums back east, debts against the property, and legal technicalities. The plan was simple: get the kids out, sell the land, and move on. But you could smell the fraud a mile off. Those debts didn't line up, witnesses couldn't be found, and the development company was a shell game run by Crawford, the local land shark that I wasn't the only one who saw it. Martha backed me up, told me Henry never owed more than he could pay, and the whole town started to murmur about how Crawford's outfit had been stripping orphans and widows of their land for years. That's where the twist slid in. Henry, quiet and steady, had left a journal. Inside were pages and pages of notes, names, evidence of a conspiracy that ran all the way to territorial judges and crooked officials. He knew what was coming for those kids and trusted I'd step up. And I did. God help me, I did. I told Winters I'd be their guardian, challenged the debts in court, and brought in the best lawyer from the capital, a bulldog named Patterson who smelled blood in every forged signature. Still, Crawford played dirty, brought in hired guns, bribed the judge, tried to isolate us, scare us off. But by then, Daniel and Rebecca weren't just charges. I was fighting for my own second chance. Then James, my son, sent a telegram from Boston. "Father, I want to meet your new family." Arriving January 20th. I nearly dropped the damn thing. 15 years gone, and he was coming west. Daniel and Rebecca worried, afraid they'd lose me to blood ties, but I told them the truth. Family is who chooses to stay, not just who shares your name. The showdown came on a freezing morning, the whole town packed into the courthouse, nerves strung tighter than fence wire. Crawford's lawyer threw every lie he had. But when I handed Henry's journal to the judge, and then Federal Marshal Quinn burst in with James and a stack of arrest warrants, the tide turned fast. Crawford tried to take the kids hostage, but Daniel stepped out, steady as a grown man, and told him, "You can't scare us anymore. We know who we are." Rebecca stood right beside him, and the whole community, Martha, Doc Whitman, even the old pastor, closed ranks. That it ended with Crawford in irons, the judge running scared, and Daniel and Rebecca clinging to each other, finally safe. 3 weeks later, in the Capitol, we stood before a new judge, and I signed adoption papers with hands that shook, not from fear, but from the weight lifting off my shoulders. James stayed on, working the ranch, and the four of us, no, 5, counting Martha, built something new on that land Henry left us. The ranch grew. Daniel proved to have a knack for cattle and fixing things. Rebecca could run a household like she was born for it, and James brought business sense from Boston I never had. The conspiracy unraveled, and by spring the governor himself asked me to help write new laws to protect orphaned families from men like Crawford. Now, when dusk falls over Cedar Ridge, I sit on the porch with the family Bible in my lap, the entries recording not just bloodkin, but the family I chose. Daniel, Rebecca, James, Martha. We fought for each other, and in that fight, I found the peace I'd been chasing all my life. You know, people always say you can't go home again. Maybe they're right. Maybe you have to build a new one, piece by piece, from what's left after the storm. So tell me, what do you think makes a family? Is it blood, or the ones who choose to stand with you when things get hard? I've given you my answer. Now I want to hear yours. Drop a comment, tell your own story, and if you believe in second chances, share this. Someone out there might need to know it's not too late. You'd think that after the courthouse showdown, with Crawford led away and the community cheering on the courthouse steps, things would settle down for us. Maybe the story would just fade into one of those peaceful endings you see in old Western paintings, sunlight slanting across green fields, everybody finally safe. But life isn't like that, you know? Some battles end, sure, but others just slide into the background, waiting for a weak moment to pounce. And that first spring in Cedar Ridge, we learned you never really outrun your shadows. You just learn to stand taller in the light. And we spent the early months fixing the cabin, James and I hauling lumber, Daniel swinging a hammer with more enthusiasm than skill, Rebecca running logistics like a tiny general, Martha bringing biscuits and no shortage of unsolicited advice, the kind you pretend to brush off but end up following anyway. And all the while, the whole valley seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if the new Holloway family would stick or shatter like so many others before us. The legal mess dragged on. Of course, Crawford's trial moved to the Capitol, federal marshals and investigators swarming through Cedar Ridge, digging up old cases, old grievances, and the air at night was thick with rumors. Folks whispering about which neighbor had sold out, who'd looked the other way, who'd lost their land to the scam and never found the courage to fight back. At the ranch, we tried to keep things normal, waking up before dawn, fixing fences, planting crops, all the chores that make a house a home, even if you're just learning how to do it as you go. You know what surprised me the most? How fast those kids bounced back. Daniel, once he realized nobody was leaving, started to smile more, even joke sometimes, and Rebecca, she began humming little tunes while she worked, just like my mother used to. Those small signs that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. I saw James grow too, the chip on his shoulder shrinking as he learned to trust me again. The way he'd watch over Daniel and Rebecca, teaching them card games or showing Daniel how to read a map, both of them leaning in close, hungry for the kind of connection only family can give. But the ghosts of the past kept slipping in through the cracks. I'd lie awake some nights, watching moonlight stripe the ceiling, thinking about all the things I should have done different if I'd stayed. if I'd fought harder, if I'd just been a better man sooner. And it's funny, but those regrets, they get quieter when you're busy, when you've got people counting on you for more than just money or orders, when love is something you show by splitting wood or sitting up with a sick kid at midnight, not just saying words. Then came the day Pastor Reynolds showed up with a letter from the territorial governor, official looking, with seals and everything, inviting me to sit on a commission, help write new laws to stop the kind of fraud that nearly took Daniel and Rebecca from us. I was proud, sure, but nervous too. Who was I to sit in judgment? A man who'd spent half his life running? But James just said, "You do it, Dad. You know what's at stake." And Rebecca, sweet as always, promised to keep the ranch going while I was away. The whole valley felt different after the trial. Folks looking out for each other a little more, gossip dying down, old grudges fading. Daniel started a project with some of the other kids, building a new chicken coop for a widow down the road. Rebecca took over Sunday meals, inviting anyone who was alone. By spring, half the town was crowding around our battered old table, laughing, arguing, passing food back and forth, the kind of noisy mess that tells you you're home. The night before I left for the capital, I sat on the porch with Daniel and Rebecca, the stars sharp as glass overhead. Daniel asked if I'd be scared, standing up to politicians and lawyers. I told him the truth. Scared every day, son, but you do what needs doing anyway. Rebecca squeezed my hand and said, "We'll be here when you get back." And I realized, right then, I wasn't alone anymore. I'd found what I thought I'd lost forever. The commission hearings were long, exhausting, stories pouring in from across the territory, families broken, land stolen, kids sent east like packages nobody wanted, and more than once I felt the anger rise up hot in my chest, remembering how close we'd come to losing everything. But there was hope too, in the testimony, in the way neighbors stood up for each other, in the laws we started to shape. Real protections, real consequences for men like Crawford Point one afternoon. Coming back from the hearings, I got a telegram from James, short and to the point. Daniel stopped a stampede. Rebecca made the best pie in Wyoming. Hurry home. I laughed for the first time in days, feeling the ache of longing settle into something softer. When I finally rolled back into Cedar Ridge, the whole family met me at the gate. James grinning, Daniel muddy but proud, Rebecca waving a pie tin like a trophy, Martha with a hug and a quiet, "Told you you'd come back." That night, after the kids went to bed, James and I sat on the porch, talking about the future, expanding the ranch, taking in more lost kids, maybe building a real schoolhouse for the valley. The world felt wide open again, not because the pain had vanished, but because we'd learned to carry it together. Sometimes, I catch myself staring at the family Bible on the shelf, the pages now thick with new names, new beginnings, and I realize that redemption doesn't look like a clean slate. It's more like a quilt, patchwork and imperfect, sewn together from mistakes and second chances, warm enough to keep out the cold, at least for a while. So here we are, one family, built out of loss and stubborn hope, standing on land that tried to break us, looking ahead to a future none of us dared dream before. And I gotta ask, how do you measure a man's worth? Is it the money he earns, the land he holds, or the hearts he helps heal? I've made my choice, right here in Cedar Ridge, and if you're listening, maybe it's time to make yours too. Let me know. Would you have stayed and fought? What would you have risked for family? Drop your story below. Share this with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And remember, sometimes the hardest road home is the only one worth taking.